It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Anouar Majid. Joining him today are two of his sons, Ridwan and Munir, and their friend Steve. And I first met Anouar in 1991. He was a guest at our bed and breakfast inn in Kennebunk Port, interviewing for a position in the English department at the University of New England. I was intrigued. Here was an Arab, fluent not only in his own language, but also in French and Spanish, applying for a job teaching English. He was hired and became a frequent guest at our home, delighting us in his stories, his insights, his curiosity, and his infectious laughter. The rest is history. Anouar grew up in the North African city of Tangiers, Morocco, attended a bilingual school taught both in Arabic and French. He got his undergraduate degree at the University of Fez, was offered a scholarship to study film in the United States, and came to New York City. He went on to graduate school, graduating with a doctoral degree in American Studies. Anouar is unique. He has a foot in two very different cultures. And to illustrate just how different these cultures are, I want to quote from Philip Haidt, author of History of the Arabs. So, quote, "Were the American to stand and watch the waters that separate Brooklyn and the rest of New York, he would think of building a bridge on which trains and cars can pass, carrying people from one side to another. But were the Easterner to stand and watch the same waters, he would probably compose a poem." Anouar is a poet. He is also a novelist, a writer of scholarly books on Islam and Muslim-Western relations, and he is a builder of bridges. For some years, he has been building bridges with words through his books, papers, and presentations. Currently, he is involved in another exciting bridge-building project with actual bricks and mortar, namely, the building of a University of New England college campus in Tangiers. So, without further ado, let me present this wonderful man, Professor Anouar Majid.
Thank you so much. Happy holiday. I feel privileged in all the years I've spent in the United States. I'm coming close to 30 years in this country. This is probably the most significant historic moment for me. Two great events at once that were mentioned by Maureen, the inauguration of a very unique president and the celebration of a very unique man's history, Martin Luther King Jr. And I come in front of you to say, what could I say in such circumstances? But, you know, I'm very grateful to a lot of people in this room. First person I met when I first came to Maine was Afy and Jack Downs. And Jack Downs was my colleague for many years at the University of New England. And I'm looking at his friend right now, Bob Howes, a former minister in the church in Kennebunk Port. And I see a number of faces in this room that I recognize have been very friendly, supportive. If I were to mention all the names, I probably wouldn't stop. But some probably know who I'm talking about. Today, I'll tell you very briefly about the history of Islam in the United States, but I want to talk about different things to commemorate, to be truly to reflect, the grandeur, if you will, of this day. Very briefly, though, I mean, Islam came to the United States soon after the conquistadors opened the country for Iberian explorers. Before the pilgrims came here, Islam was present, just like Judaism was in different parts of the American continent. We tend to forget, though, that we tend to forget that America is bigger than the current United States. So there were a lot of edicts prohibiting the migration of Muslims and Jews and Lutherans, which is Protestants, by Catholics. They were adamant about that, to the American continent. But they nevertheless managed to come, sometimes in hiding, sometimes by dissimulating their identity. And so their presence, you could find their presence here and there. But eventually, when the United States, and before the United States was established, but after the pilgrims came here, they came as slaves. About 7% maybe of African slaves who ended up in the United States were Muslim. 7% of the slaves, West African slaves that came here, were Muslims. So, and there's a very interesting history about them. They left a legacy. They persevered in so many interesting ways. Occasionally, one of them would be identified wrongly as Moroccan, because the name that was used to describe them was Moor. And people, whenever people heard the word Moor, they identified it with Morocco, which is Morocco. So there was even a case in which the United States President and the Secretary of State got involved and sort of released a person wrongly identifying him as Moroccan and so on. So they're very interesting episodes of this history that is not very largely known. But as the 19th century progressed and this earlier generation of slaves began to die off, if you will, there was, by the turn of the 20th century, what we get to see is new waves of migration and new very interesting forms of very colorful Islam, like the Moorish Science Temple of America, people coming with very interesting notions about their identity, sometimes identifying themselves as Moroccan, actually producing identification paper, showing that they were originally from Morocco. And then you have other people like the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, and of course another famous civil rights leader, Malcolm X. All of those, there's a trend, if you will. You could trace it from the 19th century, and it's sort of, and then by the early 20th century, it changes dimensions, and you begin to get this very interesting movements, which is basically a mixture of Islamic ideas and race notions and separatist, if you will, ideas. And not very, it's a uniquely American blend, if you will. It's a very often sounds alien to people in other parts of the Islamic world and Morocco too, but it is very quintessentially American. Now, but you see, now we have two members in Congress who are of Muslim descent, who are Muslims, practicing Muslims, but this is a very interesting movement. Now, the Nation of Islam, from which Malcolm X broke out, has not had a huge impact on the faith of Americans, or faith of Muslims and African Americans, which is why we need to go back to MLK Jr., and which is why, because the interesting thing about Martin Luther King Jr. is that he espoused what I would call the gospel of America. When he gave his speech about I Have a Dream speech in Washington in 1963, he quoted the Declaration of Independence, and he kept using it and emphasizing that the American Revolution is incomplete. It's incomplete because the rights of African Americans and other minorities are not being fully granted. And so he focused very brilliantly on one of the greatest gospels, if you will, of our age. And I'd like to call that gospel today, in honor of the inauguration and in honor of this very special day, the gospel of America. Now, a lot of people would find this terminology a little bit strange and maybe a little jarring. But if you go back, and as I'm standing in this church, and I took some time to read about the 7 principles of your wonderful church, and they reflect perfectly the ideals and tenets of the American Revolution, what we find in the Declaration of Independence, even before, and then what we find in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. And it's a wonderful document which makes a very compelling case of why religion and state ought to be separated. And we find it in the American Constitution, wherein public, religious practice has nothing to do with public office. So that we have actually in the United States in the late 18th century no prohibition and no no prohibition or no impediments for people, whether they be Muslim, Jew, theoretically speaking, or any other religion, Hindus, in occupying the White House. I mean, that is huge and very revolutionary. And then we find it also in the First Amendment. The right to free speech and right to one's own conscience. All of these elements together, and I think very much in sync with the theology of this church. And I think, and what I especially like about this the gospel of America, if you will, is because it is an embodiment of an idea where people could come together, profess many different faiths, and allow for dissent to take place without much persecution. Now, there's been a lot of persecution and injustices in American history, but I think once that chain of events was started with the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute, and I think there was no stopping it. And that's why we have Barack Obama right now in Washington. Because without those statements, without the gospel of America, without the Jeffersonian vision, without the long chain of American writers, beginning with Jefferson, and then you have Benjamin Franklin, probably the first major abolitionist we have on record, and then you keep going down the chain, you end up with Ralph Waldo Emerson, who gave this wonderful speech at Harvard in the 1830s, in the Divinity School address, chastising the graduates about what he called historical Christianity. People go to churches to worship somebody else's revolutionary behaviors. So and then of course we heard about MLK. Inspired by Gandhi's writings of philosophy of nonviolence. But Gandhi was influenced by Thoreau. And so Gandhi got his ideas from Thoreau, who is one of the most quintessential Americans anyone can find. And then you keep going, and then there's Robert Greene Ingersoll. I don't know, not many people know him. He is the one who single-handedly revived Thomas Paine's legacy in the 19th century. He was an agnostic. He went around the country preaching the doctrines of free speech, of secularism, and making a very good case for heresy. And this church has made a very... I don't know whether you know this. In 2007, I published a book called A Call for Heresy. I mean, there's never been a more appropriate place for me to be. So, and I think, what a great vision that you are here upholding. In fact, this is something I'm working on. I've been working on this project for a number of years now. If my next project will have to deal with the consequences of orthodoxy in the Christian church and its effect over the centuries, including and how Islam came to be as a result of some of this decision taken in the early Christian history. And so, to be in a church that for the first time, probably in history, if I'm not mistaken, has broken away from this orthodoxy and created a notion, came up with a notion. I'm not very familiar with your theology yet, but created a notion of oneness, but which is all-encompassing notion of oneness, that everybody is included in this oneness, which reflects perfectly, again, the notion of out of the many, one. What I'd like to say is we are celebrating today both the history of this church, which is the wonderful accompaniment to the American Revolution. And I went to your website and I read a little bit about the history of this church, and I think if there's one church that almost reflects perfectly the ideal, American ideals, it's got to be this church. I mean, it's definitely not Islam, and it's not, to my knowledge, Catholicism and other religions, but it's got to be this church because everybody's included, everybody's accepted, there is no discrimination of any kind, and people are united around a broader and more generous concept of love and loving everybody else. It is not very easy to do. And it is not, because religions are by very definition exclusive, and it is striking that in this day and age, in the 21st century, that I have to speak louder, pick up this in the back, that we have people still believing in exclusivist notions that were created or they were concocted 2,000 years ago by people in a different part of the globe when there was a lot of tribal infighting, when there were very primitive conditions. And now we are living in the 21st century with with very sophisticated technology, great medical schools, great hospitals and museums, big universities, and we still identify with a very narrow notion of identity. That has to change. I think it's time, at least just for intellectual consistency and some coherence. We have to change this notion of ourselves as members of a very primitive tribe that existed many millennia ago. And I think this church, I'm not saying this to flatter you. I mean, I looked very closely. I am a heretic. I did. And I think, this church does reflect that spirit. The other questions, and how does one make this church a vibrant institution? How does one create, what is a substitute to traditional religion? All of those issues have to be worked out in some kind of interesting way. But philosophically and theologically, there is no better institution in my mind that reflects, and that the spirit of the American Revolution and the spirit of dissent that is vital to human freedom, and the very philosophy that made MLK possible. MLK would not have been able to succeed if he had not been an American. Now, he got many accolades over the years. He had many awards and honors. He was honored in so many. There's a holiday for him. I mean, that's because in time, because of that seed that was planted in the 18th century, all of this became possible. And then we need, as I look now, since the topic is Islam and America, and I'm talking more about America than about Islam, for a reason. Because Muslims need this American philosophy more than ever. They need this ability to be open to all kinds of creeds. They need the ability to accept everyone within the fold. They need to understand how to work together without resorting to violence, how to work out the differences without resorting to violence. There is a tremendous amount of ignorance right now in in different parts of the Islamic world. We tend to romanticize them sometimes, but these people are simply wrong. They're uneducated, they don't know much about the world, they don't know much about history, and their view of their religion is extremely, extremely narrow. And so the American philosophy, the American religion, the American gospel, the Gospels of Jefferson, if you will, the Unitarian Universalist Church, with its very generous and very inclusive theology, is badly needed in those parts of the world. I've been saying this before I came to speak to you today. I said this in parts of the Muslim world, and I said it to all kinds of audiences. And I think as the world is changing and new powers are rising, we need to cherish more than ever these twin gospels, or this overarching gospel of both the ideals of the American Revolution and the philosophy and theology of a very courageous church, which is your church, which for the first time in millennia was able to break away from the rigid orthodoxies imposed by Constantine and his followers. And I think, I think it's a very revolutionary moment. It's a very happy moment for me to be speaking to you today. It's a glorious day. It's beautiful outside. And I thank you for coming, and thank you.
Dr. Majid has graciously agreed to take some questions, and I'm going to start. I'm going to pull rank here. I have been reading Islam and America. I'm trained in history. I was immediately struck by his impeccable historical research. You can keep that as for you. It's a card. I would really highly recommend this book. There's something he says in the preface, and I'm going to use that to frame this question. Just as Americans have long been blinded to the realities of Muslim societies through their attachment to biblical geographies and truths, so have Muslims been trapped in a belief system that prevented them from becoming equal partners in the making of contemporary civilization. All right. I would like to ask you, Professor, could you encapsulate that a little bit and tell me what those things are that you believe have trapped Muslims and prevented them from maybe becoming full partners in this contemporary history making?
Okay. The answer to the question is probably in the first part of my sentence, which is Muslims live in the Muslim state of mind, if you wish. That's a very essentialist concept, but I'll use it for the sake of simplicity. Is always moving backward. You know, the best times were the golden age of the first caliphs, which is the age when the prophet died. It was followed by four caliphs, four people who replaced him, and everybody tends to think that was the golden age. It is deeply embedded in people's consciousness, but without much critical and historical examination. There is that trend towards nostalgia is what is keeping, in my view, the Muslim world, what was holding back the Muslim world. You know, they keep being pulled back to an age that never was. And so instead of freeing themselves from that and going forward to an age that has yet to be. So it is that kind of lack of courage to break free from that tradition, which is very, very powerful. And it is, I mean, I've had people I've had so many discussions with people who are highly educated, and they feel somewhat, they're looking for solutions to how to get out of this, you know, theology of the past, if you will, which is a very embellished past, very little historical accuracy. And so they always, that's what's holding them back. It's a notion that the past was great and golden and glorious, and then if we only could go back and retrieve that golden past, we can be a better and stronger nation now and in the future. It is a very very tempting attitude. It's very, there's a lot of, I can see how it might be tempting, but it is completely misleading.
Do you see a connection there between, I mean, can't you see that same theme running through Christian fundamentalism, Judaism? I mean, isn't this something that we're struggling with?
Yes. In my approach, and with all respect to people of different religions in this room, is I find all religions to be the same, all the monotheistic religions to be the same. Judaism was the first, was the template for all the religions that followed, and then of course Christianity has it's a variation of Judaism, and Islam is a variation on both. And so, but basically what it is a notion of the sacred that has lost its relevance in this day and age. But people are attached to it, and they're still fighting for it, and they still, and the first part of that sentence is that biblical geography, if you will. And people, if you look back in the 19th century in the United States, people rushed to the Holy Land because it was it was the best tourist destination of the time. It was real. I mean, remember Mark Twain in Innocents Abroad? I think of that. People, it was the place to be. I mean, I don't know what maybe it was the equivalent of Cancun. I don't know.
The biblical Cancun?
It was the place to go. I mean, if there had been planes, there'd be the charter flights. I mean, but then there was quickly some disappointment. Herman Melville was very disappointed, and Mark Twain, of course, didn't see anything that's interesting. So they had this it was powerful and huge. People were more familiar with the geography in the Bible than they were in their own local geographies. So, because they went to Sunday schools, and they read about these things. So, what they did, the net effect of all of this activity is they invested a very old piece of land with a tremendous amount of sacredness, and they got stuck in that sacredness. So my solution in this book is to dissolve that, is to move away from that, and just to see that piece of land over which people are fighting as nothing more than a piece of land. It is a piece of land. There's nothing, if there's a creator out there who created everything, then there's no reason why Palestine or Israel ought to be more sacred than, I said, Uruguay or Iceland or Chile or Venezuela or even, Morocco, I mean, it's a crazy idea, but somehow it's so deeply, think about it, it's so deeply ingrained that we actually do believe that some places in the globe created by the same force that created everything are more sacred than others.
Thank you. Question over there.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about what I see in this country as Islamophobia? And I find that rather distressing, and yet at the same time we have to deal with what just happened in Algeria and in Mali and in other parts of the world where Islam is extremist.
I don't like the word Islam. I don't like anything that ends with phobia. You see, okay. Okay. The reason why, because the question or the concept traps us in a particular kind of discussion. It frames a discussion. What has happened, if you go back to the early American history, from the Pilgrims on, I mean, if you want to see it that way, there's always been Islamophobia. And the Islamophobia was a result of what, again, I'm simplifying the terms just for the sake of convenience, it's a clash of civilizations. When Islam was born in the 7th century, the first thing it did, it conquered Christian lands. The first thing, before you knew it, they were in Syria taking over, conquering Christian lands, and they kept doing that all the way through North Africa and Spain, and they tried to go to France, and eventually they kept trying to get Constantinople till they did in the 15th century. So Islam was not some sort of peace-loving religion that showed up on the face of the earth. It was a very militant religion, and so what it created is a response. It created a response from the Christians, so that tension or that conflict between Islam and Christianity started in the 7th century and has barely ended now. So if you look, even Europe was constituted as a nation because of its reaction to Islam. European identity is inconceivable without its reaction to the Islamic threat in the Middle Ages. And if you look at the series of crusades that were undertaken beginning from the 11th century and on, you could see the same pattern. Europe was unified. Nothing unifies a nation or a community better than an external threat. And so the European identity was born out of its clash with Islam. So it is very hard to reverse that. We need to reverse that by finding interesting tricks to have people, to dissuade them from thinking in this deeply, to think in this way. And so if you look at it this way, Christopher Columbus, when he was coming to America in 1492, he told the monarchs of Spain, he said, the reason I'm doing this, yes, I'm going to get some gold and spices, but the main reason is to make you wealthy enough to reconquer Jerusalem from the Muslims. So the reconquest of Jerusalem was the #1 motive and the leading motive of Christopher Columbus. So, and then when the pilgrims came here, they brought with them that legacy. It's inevitable, the Christian legacy, and they saw Muslims as infidels, the prophet as an impostor, and they're moreover, they were the Muslim sort of pirates, quote unquote, were capturing American vessels and enslaving Christians in North Africa, and that situation remained all the way in the 19th century, even after the American Revolution. So a war with Tripoli now is part of the Marines hymn, you could see that. And so there's a long history of clashes that is very hard to get rid of, mentally, intellectually, and culturally. So Islamophobia, when somebody says Islamophobia, well, you're Islamophobic nowadays, that simplifies, that almost trivializes a long and complex history of conflict that involves both sides. And if we use the term Islamophobia, we definitely need to use the word Christianophobia or Judeophobia, because Muslims do not have more benign perception of the Christians or of the Jews or of other people. So it's got to be, these phobias are shared, if you will, and if we need to get rid of them, we need to understand the root causes that have created them. Vicky.
Bringing to the present, my question is, how are we doing here in Maine regarding the day-to-day lives and treatment of the Muslim people that live right here among us?
Well, that I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
Are we treating you all right?
I don't know. I don't know what I'm a heretic. I'm a heretic. Yes. Hi, Linda.
My question is, you keep coming back, the answer seems to be to help free people in their limited identification, right? How is that best done? Where's the leverage? Is it in the arts? Is it in policy? Do you understand?
Yes, I do. It's not easy. Oh, the question is, how do we liberate ourselves from these narrow forms of identification? It's not easy, but it requires courage. I know that. It requires courage because people tend to, it's easier to embrace and fall into already existing categories, and and you know, I'm a Muslim and you're a Christian and you're a Jew and you're this and this that. But my identity is way more complex than that. In fact, you know, I am a heretic, and and that's why I love being in this church. And but it's people sometimes in the name of a benevolent idea, of a liberal notion, they continue to remake or reinvent these categories, because in order, for some interesting reason. I mean, I have to say, and liberals, many liberals are kind of engaged in this kind of, out of very good intentions. You know, they, instead of being critical the way they are about a lot of other things, economic and political and so on, when it comes to religions, and because they want to be very respectful of diversity, and because of this and that, they treat it very differently. And I think if you have a critical mind, apply it universally and across the board without any discrimination, without any hesitation, in order to challenge every human being to live up to their best abilities and possibilities. I mean, religions are no exceptions. Religions, in fact, should be treated even more critically, because they come with us with a bunch of assumptions that we are simply supposed to believe in. And our religion basically is, very simply, and once many years ago, a peace negotiator, a very well-known man, helps people establish peaceful relations around the globe. He told me basically faith is, let's say God spoke to Linda, and then Linda came to me and said, God told me. And then I believed what Linda told me. It's not that I wouldn't believe it, Linda, but that is a structure of faith. Faith, God chooses, and this notion of religion and faith was criticized by early Muslims like Razi, Abu Bakr Razi, a great physician in the 9th century in Baghdad. He said this notion that God would choose a handful of people and speak to them personally, and then the rest of the globe would just simply believe what these people tell us. He found that to be absolutely ridiculous. And he was, in fact, there was a literature in Islamic history about this. It's called the proof of prophecy. And with all of these books, the people who wrote against this notion of prophecy, their works have been not extant. We haven't been able to find them, but we find an indication of their work in the refutations. But there was a literature going on, people refuting these people's denial of prophecy. And in talking about prophecy, what is prophecy? I keep telling people all the time, and we mentioned it. We saw it in Emerson's address to the graduates at Harvard in the 19th century. The prophecy is always, by definition, revolutionary. There's no other way to be a prophet. The prophetic element in anything is to go against the status quo, to change habits, to completely dismantle existing structures, and to create new ones. And so, if we are going to be inspired by the prophets, and if we want to emulate them, which is even better, then we need to continually be on our guard against assumptions or inherited assumptions that may no longer be relevant to us today. And remember, as much as I love the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Statute of Religious Freedom in Virginia, I think Jefferson, too, that every generation ought to have its own constitution. He was the most revolutionary of the lot of the founding fathers. So I think to constantly be in a state of mental revolution is what is needed to be against, to guard against inherited dogmas and false assumptions.
Mr. Majid, you
Yes.
spoke rather kindly of our expression of faith as
Yes.
a quintessential American faith. I admit to a bias, but I thank you, Paul. But now my question. What made both one of the many things that made both Unitarianism and Universalism a possibility was in the 19th century and late 18th century, there arose a critical study of Holy Scriptures, both the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Scriptures. And out of that, those new lenses taken to Scriptures gave rise to a more liberal, even radical way of being religious in the world, and here we are. To my knowledge, there has never been any such critical analysis and study of the Muslim Scriptures. Is that correct?
It is correct. It is correct, and it's a big challenge. I know there are a handful of people working on this project. I am trying to work on this project, and I mean, I'm trying to do it openly and publicly, but the handful of people who are working on it, most of them are in Germany, you know, and some are using pseudonyms to do so. It gives you an idea of the kinds of challenges facing the community. You know, in other words, it's a notion of the sacred. It's so powerful. It leads to, well, you know what it leads to, and people have not been able to liberate themselves from the tyranny of the sacred, and it's an imagined sacredness. It has no. I can speak from my experiences. When I published a book in 2007 called A Call for Heresy, and one of the early reviewers said, well, Majid is suggesting that the Quran may not be of divine origin. So I was in Washington, and I was with a group of Muslims. You know, I gave a talk about the book, and it was very tense. That was introduced. You know, many of them were from Pakistan, and some of them were very conservative. And they said, "Well, are you saying something like this in this book?" And I said, "Well, I don't know what I'm saying in this book, but you tell me, how does the Word of God become a published book?" Tell me how. I mean, okay, God spoke to the prophet, but how did it become a published book that we carry in us and put in our briefcases and so on and so forth? What happened between that and that? So it is these processes that people find that they completely, you should see the talk and literature. It is indicative. The question you just asked goes to the heart of the problem, because people refuse, because if they find out really what happened, and it's not very difficult to find out what happened, their faith will collapse, they will remain faithless, they will lose their identity, and they will be lost to themselves and then, I guess, to the world. But it's a mistake, because it happened, as you said, in Europe and the United States, and there are a lot of people who are still Christian, and a lot of people who are still Jewish, and a lot of people who are still differently. But if that were to happen in the Islamic world, it would be a great sign. Then I'll start to believe that there will be progress and real freedom in those societies. Sorry, Jane.
There have been so many advances in science, from theoretical physics to technology, and how that has changed all of us in our thinking. And I was wondering if you could just comment on how that has affected the evolving understanding of Islam or religion.
Well, you know, the same thing. This is like, this question dovetails with Marcel's question, and what it is basically, how do you bring latest scientific knowledge to apply to questions of faith? I mean, the interesting thing here is faith it's a supernatural event. It's a miracle or a miraculous event is supernatural. It doesn't obey the laws of nature. And so so you need to say, okay, the first and foremost question should be, should we make this assumption or not? Should we say that there are some things in history, like a virgin birth, for example, or a number of things that happened? Do they really happen, or just they are mythical accounts of the stories about how the nation was formed, how religion came about, and so on? If people insist that these things really happened, then I don't know what to do. Because a lot of these people who insist on that this has happened, many of them have PhDs in engineering and all that stuff. So it's like, it's very interesting. You know, one can be a great scientist, a mechanical engineer or a computer engineer and so on, and still believe in very antique notions about faith and human community and so on and so forth. They don't see the contradiction in this. It's not seen. But if you were to, this is the work I'm doing now. If you were to look at, say, how a religion is born, you could see that it evolves over a long period of time. It's not a surprise that Islam was born in the way it was born. I mean, not exactly. We're not sure whether it was born in Mecca, by the way. But it's part of the Middle East landscape. There was Judaism and there was Christianity, and Judaism took centuries to evolve and develop, and there was a lot of myth-making in Judaism, and there was a lot of myth-making and creation in Christianity. Christianity was created by a number of factors, including Constantine, and so there were many elements involved in the creation of a religion. It is not as if a person wakes up one day and says, okay, here's your Bible, oh, here's your Torah, and here's your Quran. And so it is these processes could be studied, and I think they have been studied in Christianity and Islam, and they're just beginning to be studied. I'm sorry, Christianity and Judaism. They're just beginning to be studied in Islam, and that's what I'm doing these days. I'm spending a lot of time looking at that late antique period, which is to say, I mean, in fact, I go as early as ancient Greece to see some connection between what's happened then and the rise of Islam, and going through Judaism and Christianity and so on and so forth. So, and the other thing I want to mention about this church, which reminds me, just one second, and which is, you know, I think there were two moments of freedom in all of Western history. Now, I'm going to make a broad statement. It may be problematic to many of you, but I'll take the risk. You know, one is in pagan Greece. Before the rise of Christianity, before Alexander the Great, there was a great moment of freedom in the city-states of Athens and other Greece. That's when everything developed, notions of freedom and democracy, philosophy, the meaning of life. There was no national religion. It was a pagan, non-monotheistic society. Then came Christianity and eclipsed and crushed all of those efforts, and over time and the centuries. And that idea would not be revived until the Enlightenment, you know, which in the 18th century. And so the United States, in my fanciful history, the United States is the first embodiment of this notion, you know, as a state. It comes out of this matrix, which has long been eclipsed by a series of monotheistic religions, all the way to so we have these great moments of freedom in history. Ancient Greece, the Enlightenment, and which makes me worry about the fate, the long-term fate of the United States and this idea that came out in the American Revolution, which is why it ought to be championed and protected and cherished, because these moments do not last forever in history.
It's your podium, Doctor.
Okay, hold on.
We'll take one more question.
I guess I was just thinking about this, and I'm thinking, my feeling as a cynic is most religions have been born out of power and control and money.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I see what happened in our latest election and the whole rise of the religious sort of recall right. Is that still like a matter of power?
There are many ways to answer a question like this, but you know, the one, you know, the safest way to do it is maybe through a philosophy, but not heavy-duty philosophy. I mean, I'm not just certain. You know, if you look, I was bringing my first. I kept one of my earliest editions of the American Anthology, North Anthology of American Literature, which contains a lot of wisdom. And here's the Jefferson Bible, by the way. It's the edited Bible. If you read Emerson's Self-Reliance, and if you read Thoreau's, Resistance to Civil Government or Life Without Principle, which is a great essay, by the way, I highly recommend them. I think that ought to be the Bible for everybody. You know, what you see there is, and if self-reliance, I used to teach it or recommend that it be read back to back with the Marxist Communist Manifesto. And because what it does, it shows you, it gives you a tremendous amount of insight and wisdom about how to live your life, you know, free from these obsessions, like you mentioned. It seems like we are still very primitive in our desires and our pursuits. And I think, you know, we pursue security, financial security, and that is, which is in a capitalist system, it's a very vexing pursuit. You know, you have to plot and keep plotting to make sure you don't fall into some sort of bad situation and protect your family. So that's why Marx in the Communist Manifesto says the first thing that goes is inheritance. Now, people object to that, but if you have a society without inheritance, then the system creates conditions of security for everyone, regardless of how much, you don't have to leave them a thing, because society takes care of the kids, of the family. But in self-reliance and life without principle, it talks about the futility of pursuing a life of pursuing this kind of life, because it takes you away from better things in life: meditation, reflection, writing, contemplation. So the busier you are trying to secure a better future, the less of yourself, the more of yourself you're losing now. So I think this requires a dramatic change in our conception of society, of how we do business. But I think if you look historically, it seems to me that we're still at a very early stage of development, in the broader scheme of things. We may get some generation, maybe 200 years from now, maybe 1,000 years from now, that those societies will come to a point where they think that we've been doing is not very smart. But I don't know how to answer that question, but to share with you this kinds of thoughts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You have been wonderful. Thank you.